Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the notice inserted at the beginning of the Vom Kriege in its first edition that was found essentially as a sum of considerations von Clausewitz, of the author, on his work while still it was still in progress. You know that the Vom Kriege is actually unfinished and posthumous, and von Clausewitz essentially in this Nachricht, so it's actually so this message, this news, this information explains fundamentally in rather briefly compared to obviously to the extension of the work, what was the work was conceived like, and how the work was progressing fundamentally. Then eventually there is the introduction of the author that follows it, and that is something and it's actually shorter even than this notice as a text, and we will read it next time. But this part is very interesting for several reasons. First of all, from a philological point of view, it actually is made up by two parts. The first one was written in 1827. The other one was found by essentially those who read von Clausewitz's manuscript after his death, so his wife, his colleagues and disciples, etc. That is not dated actually, so we don't know, but it is believed to have been very recent, relatively recent, however, later than 1827 and before von Clausewitz died in 1831. So this notice contains a set of informations that also begin somewhat to introduce also certain fixed principles, and gives a broader idea of what the evolution of von Clausewitz thought on his own work really was. So you know that I began this series on the Vom Kriege relatively recently. Last time I made a video on, in fact, the preface that Marie von Clausewitz, née von Brühl, inserted in the edition, the first edition of the Vom Kriege, in which she also explains partly what essentially his husband had wanted, chiefly the fact he actually wished to his work to be published after his death anyway, since the beginning, but while he wasn't still, he was expecting maybe to die because he was a military man, was involved in dangerous business, but actually much before his illness and his actual death. And she also explains partly what the attitude of von Clausewitz had been towards his work, etc. So this can go together also because this notice has been inserted, in fact, by the same, eventually by the same Marie, as she directed in a certain sense, and she was acquainted to the edition and work in itself. So now we'll just read the text, and after that we will comment it together. So I look upon the first 6 books, of which a fair copy has now been made, as only a mass which is still in a manner without form, and which has yet to be again revised. In this revision, the two kinds of war will be everywhere kept more distinctly in view, by which all ideas will acquire a clearer meaning, a more precise direction, and a closer application. The two kinds of war are, first, those in which the object is the overthrow of the enemy, whether it be that we aim at his destruction politically, or merely at disarming him and forcing him to conclude peace on our terms. And next, those in which our object is merely to make some conquests on the frontiers of his country, either for the purpose of retaining them permanently, or for turning them to account as matter of exchange in the settlement of a peace. Transition from one kind to the other must certainly continue to exist, but the completely different nature of the tendencies of the two must everywhere appear, and must separate from each other things which are incompatible. Besides establishing this real difference in wars, another practically necessary point of view must at the same time be established, which is that war is only a continuation of state policy by other means. This point of view, being adhered to everywhere, will introduce much more unity into the consideration of the subject, and things will be more easily disentangled from each other. Although the chief application of this point of view does not commence until we get to the 8th book, still it must be completely developed in the first book, and also lend assistance throughout the revision of the first 6 books. Through such a revision, the first 6 books will get rid of a good deal of dross, many rents and chasms will be closed up, and much that is of a general nature will be transformed into distinct conceptions of and forms. The 7th book, on attack, for the different chapters of which sketches are already made, is to be considered as a reflection of the 6th, and must be completed at once according to the above mentioned more distinct points of view, so that it will require no fresh revision, but rather may serve as a model in the revision of the first 6 books. For the 8th book, on the plan of a war, that is, of the organization of a world war in general, several chapters are designed, but they are not at all to be regarded as real materials. They are merely a track, roughly cleared, as it were, through the mass, in order by that means to ascertain the points of most importance. They have answered this object, and I propose, on finishing the 7th book, to proceed at once to the working out of the 8th, where the 2 points of view above mentioned will be chiefly affirmed, by which everything will be simplified, and at the same time have a spirit breathed into it. I hope in this book to iron out many creases in the heads of strategists and statesmen, and at least to show them to show the object of action and the real point to be considered in war. Now, when I have brought my ideas clearly out by finishing this 8th book, and have properly established the leading features of war, it will be easier for me to carry the spirit of these ideas into the first 6 books, and to make these same features show themselves everywhere. Therefore, I shall defer till then the revision of the first 6 books. Should the work be interrupted by my death, then what is found can only be called a mass of conceptions not brought into form. But as these are open to endless misconceptions, they will doubtless give rise to a number of crude criticisms. For in these things, everyone thinks, when he takes up his pen, that whatever comes into his head is worth saying and printing, and quite as incontrovertible as that twice 2 make 4. If such a one would take the pains, as I have done, to think over the subjects for years, and to compare his ideas with military history, he would certainly be a little more guarded in his criticism. Still, notwithstanding this imperfect form, I believe that an impartial reader, thirsting for truth and conviction, will rightly appreciate in the first 6 books the fruits of several years' reflection and a diligent study of war, and that, perhaps, he will find in them some leading ideas which may bring about a revolution in the theory of war. Berlin, July the 10th, 1827. Then here the editors add, besides this notice, amongst the papers left, the following unfinished memorandum was found, which appears of very recent date. And there von Clausewitz goes again. The manuscript of the conduct of the Great War, which will be found after my death, in its present state, can only be regarded as a collection of materials from which it is intended to construct a theory of war. With the greater part I am not yet satisfied, and the 6th book is to be looked at as a mere essay. I should have completely remodeled it, and have tried a different line. But the ruling principles which pervade these materials I hold to be the right ones. They are the result of a very varied reflection, keeping always in view the reality, and always bearing in mind what I have learned by experience and by my intercourse with distinguished soldiers. The 7th book is to contain the attack, the subjects of which are thrown together in a hasty manner, the 8th, the plan for a war, in which I would have examined war more especially in its political and human aspects. The first chapter, the first book, is the only one which I considered as completed. It will at least serve to show the manner in which I propose to treat the subject throughout. The theory of the Great War, or strategy as it is called, is beset with extraordinary difficulties, and we may affirm that very few men have clear conceptions of the separate subjects, that is, conceptions carried up to their full logical conclusions. In real action, most men are guided merely by the tact of judgment, which hits the object more or less accurately, according as they possess more or less genius. This is the way in which all great generals have acted, and therein partly lay their greatness and their genius, that they always hit upon what was right by this tact. Thus also it will always be in action, and so for this tact is amply sufficient. But when it is a question not of acting oneself, but of convincing others in a consultation, then all depends on clear conceptions and demonstration of the inherent relations, and so little progress has been made in this respect that most deliberations are merely a contention of words, resting on no firm basis, and ending either in every one retaining his own opinion, or in a compromise from mutual considerations of respect, a middle course really without any value. Clear ideas on these matters are therefore not wholly useless. Besides, the human mind has a general tendency to clearness, and always wants to be consistent with the necessary order of things. Owing to the great difficulties attending a philosophical construction of the art of war, and the many attempts at it that have failed, most people have come to the conclusion that such a theory is impossible, because it concerns things which no standing law can embrace. We should also join in this opinion, and give up any attempt at a theory, were it not that a great number of propositions make themselves evident without any difficulty, as for instance that the defensive form with a negative object is the stronger form, the attack with a positive object the weaker, that great results carry the little ones with them, that therefore strategic effects may be referred to certain centers of gravity, that a demonstration is a weaker application of force than a real attack, that therefore there must be some special reason for resorting to the former, that victory consists not merely in the conquest on the field of battle, but in the destruction of armed forces, physically and morally, which can in general only be effected by a pursuit after the battle is gained. That successes are always greatest at the point where the victory has been gained, that, therefore, the change from one line and object to another can only be regarded as a necessary evil, that a turning movement is only justified by a superiority of numbers generally, or by the advantage of our lines of communications and retreat over those of the enemy, that flank positions are only justifiable on similar grounds, that every attack becomes weaker as it progresses. So just for completeness, I'm using the translation by Colonel J.J. Graham. They also use for the preface of Marie von Clausewitz, published in London in 1873. So this is our real first meeting with von Clausewitz, and I think that you followed my reading, you understand already what kind of person we're reading and studying. So a in relatively few pages, he's able to actually condensate many thoughts together that are definitely very, very interesting. So first of all, von Clausewitz is essentially in the part from 1827, then we pass to the latter, that is perhaps the most interesting. He's looking at the first 6 books that at this point were evidently already being written, and although they were apparently a shapeless mass that had still to be again revised, as von Clausewitz states. And he says, in this original 2 kinds of war will be everywhere kept more distinctly in view. So he traces these 2 different types that according to of war that according to me the term used in German is Art, which would be essentially a type, but in the way it is carried out. So it says this distinction is very important because all ideas that are contained in this material will acquire a clearer meaning, a more precise direction, and a closer application if borne in mind. So these two kinds of warfare are the following. First of all, what in German he calls the Niederwerfen des Gegners, that here is being translated as overthrow of the enemy. Niederwerfen is particular in German. I'm sorry we can't obviously translate Vom Kriege from the original, but essentially it's a bit more than overthrow. I think the best translation in English would be to prostrate, fundamentally, because Nieder is like the Netherlands, the lowlands, basically. So Werfen is throwing, so basically it's not just, it's reducing the enemy power to annihilate him in some way. This reduction. And he explains how this can be carried out. It can be done either we are aiming at his destruction, politically, for instance, or merely at disarming him and forcing him to conclude peace on our terms. The other one, so this is a more totalizing, achievement in war. We've seen that the object of war is basically to curb the enemy to your own will. This happens through we'll see it when we will comment on the later when we'll begin the books and chapters proper, one by one. The other one is what appears to be a more reductive action of war, which is the one whose object is merely to make some conquests on the frontiers of his country. Von Clausewitz says either for the purpose of retaining them permanently, or of turning them to account as a matter of exchange in a settlement of peace. So essentially the seizing of a part of, here he uses the term frontier, yes, an den Grenzen, so it means at the borders fundamentally. And here he stressed that the transition from one kind of the other, so as we've seen, essentially either bending the enemy to your own will to annihilate him, and to just take these pieces of land at the frontier to use them in some way, fundamentally, must be certainly, do not exclude other types of war, substantially, but the completely different nature of the tendencies of the two must be always appear in every context, must separate from each other things which are kind of incompatible. So then he enunciates the phrase that is fundamentally, the most famous, in absolute terms, is the most quoted, the most famous, the most misquoted, in the sense that usually, it's the only thing that we remembered about von Clausewitz's theory, is that der Krieg nichts ist als die fortgesetzte Staatspolitik mit anderen Mitteln. So fundamentally, here's translated that war is only a continuation of state policy. Here is translated, usually it's translated politics, but Staatspolitik here is explicitated by other means. So war is only a continuation of politics by other means. And he states this by saying that besides establishing the aforementioned difference into the types of wars, essentially there is another practically necessary point of view, he says, that always must be at the same time established. So it is universal in every kind of war we're studying. Then he adds, this point of view is to adhere practically everywhere, and will introduce much more unity into the consideration of the subject, and things will be more easily disentangled from each other. Now, this is interesting. I don't know, now I don't want to get into details, but that von Clausewitz essentially got to this affirmation as if it was something necessary to it's not a given principle, it's something that he has enunciated actually later, compared to this differentiation between the overthrowing, let's say, of the enemy and to the part of seizing the frontiers. So the fact that war is only a continuation of politics by other means in 1827 from Clausewitz now at this point is used to disentangle every other consideration that is may occur. Here, in fact, he explains why, because it says, although the chief application of this point of view does not commence until we get to the 8th book, so to the last one that eventually was the one practically on the planning of war, the plan of war plan, practically, it says it must be completely developed in the first book, and also lent assistance throughout the revision on the first 6 books. And this is what he will eventually do, because you know that the first book is the only one that basically von Clausewitz completed in an indefinitive form. Here we are still in 1827. So he explains that through such a revision, the first 6 books will get rid of a good deal of dross, many rents and chasms will be closed up, and much that is of a general nature will be transformed into distinct conceptions and forms. So it will be ordered fundamentally through these criteria. Then it says the 7th book, the one on attack, for the different chapters of which sketches are already made, is to be considered as a reflection of the 6th. The 6th one is about the defense, fundamentally. In German, the attack in this sense is Angriff, which is kind of very interesting semantically, because in German there is also, I think, the French-derived word Attacke, and the Attacke stresses essentially this even somewhat physical or verbal even aggression. So it's at a very individual level. Angriff comes from the verb angreifen, greifen an. Fundamentally, it means to march ahead, fundamentally, but in a sort of seizing manner. So this gives a kind of a very dynamic and vision. This is why von Clausewitz should be studied at all times from the original. You can't understand objectively the Vom Kriege if you don't read it from the original, because there are certain concepts in German that are somewhat also very fluid, very plastic, and you can understand also von Clausewitz's genius only if you fully understand what's the semantic shade of the words he uses actually means. Unfortunately, we can't do it because I have mostly an English audience, and I think we can reasonably discuss the Vom Kriege also through this language without problem, always given that I should also care looking at the translation and giving more, but sometimes are relative details. Other terms instead are way more important, as we will see in a while. So at what points we were here, it says the 7th book on attack, for the different chapters in which sketches are already made, is to be considered as a reflection of the 6th. So the one on the defense, as we've said, it must be completed at once according to the above mentioned more distinct points of view, so it will require no fresh revision, but rather may serve as a model in the revision of the first 6 books. Okay, this is kind of clear, self-explanatory. For the 8th book on the plan of war, that is, of the organization of the world war in general, several chapters are designed. But they are not at all to be regarded as real materials, they are merely a track, roughly cleared, as it were, through the mass, in order by that means to ascertain the points of most importance. So this 8th book at this point was already a kind of a sketchy form that he was still kind of exploring conceptually from what it seems at least that I'm reading. And they have answered this object, and I propose, on finishing the 7th book, to proceed at once to the working out of the 8, where the 2 points of view above mentioned will be chiefly affirmed, by which everything will be simplified, and at the same time have a spirit breathed into it. It's a beautiful expression. Then, excuse me, I just wanted to look, okay, which terms he uses. Okay, he uses the word Geist, actually, so this spirit that is here is being translated in fact as breathed in, but it's something more. It's Geist, yeah, okay, breathed in the sense of pneuma in ancient Greek, but it's somewhat different. It's a Geist that pervades, it's a kind of a ghost that pervades this spirit. It's very important because you know that von Clausewitz was heavily influenced also by idealism in many ways. He had this very important visions, even in the way he was. The Vom Kriege is very plastic, even in the metaphors, but in these language choices, von Clausewitz gives many physical analogies, by the way, many physically inspired metaphors. It's very beautiful to read, really, in the original. I think the learning German is worth just to read the von Clausewitz. Okay, then he says something that sadly realistic, because he said, should the work be interrupted by my death, then what is found can only be called a mass of conceptions not brought into form. Now we know that in fact von Clausewitz died before he completed the work. Now he was in 1827. I don't think he was thinking to die like immediately. The other note after the last one after 1827 might have been written. I don't know. I should ask an expert who knows this thing, but I don't think we actually know when it happened. It might have been actually written very close to his death, possibly when he got sick with cholera, eventually to die. Well, in Poland. Well, that's still, however, nevertheless interesting, and you can fear his kind of this idea of the end incumbent, looming fundamentally on his. So he says, he judges this. He says, then what is found can only be of my work, fundamentally can be called a mass of conceptions not brought into form. So here's what he feared, because he says, but as these are open to endless misconceptions, they will doubtless give rise to a number of crude criticisms. And he gets polemical, because he says, for in these things, everyone thinks when he takes up his pen that whatever comes into his head is worth saying and printing, and quite as incontrovertible as that twice two make four. This is a kind of very actual phrase. You know, everybody thinks without, speaks without thinking and thinking over, just thinking something and pretending that is valuable or meaningful. And in addition, not only he does that, this person does that, but also pretends that this thinking must be true, because it's just, the individual thinks that must be special or something. So von Clausewitz was deeply concerned by this misconception. Should he died suddenly with this work still not brought into complete form. And then he says, if such a one would take the pains, as I have done, to think over the subject for years and to compare his ideas with military history, he would certainly be a little more guarded in his criticism. So here is pointing out, what the pains that he had suffered to write down the subject for years. Von Clausewitz had been arguably working all of his life on this theory. I mean, he had, started to conceive these problems even, before starting writing naturally the Vom Kriege. And plus, we're talking about one of the most important military theorists at the time, the Prussian army. So, he's not just a person like anyone writing. As we have seen in von Clausewitz, the video on von Clausewitz's biography, he had fought in all the Napoleonic Wars. He distinguished himself. He had acquired a huge amount of practice. And yet he introduces also another very important element that distinguishes von Clausewitz, because he gives this enormous, rightfully by the way, enormous importance to military history, as we will see hopefully going on this series. Von Clausewitz attributes an enormous importance to history when it gets to the the drawing fundamentally of the military art. As military history is an incredibly important source for practical evidence, fundamentally, that can be used to frame into a broader theory. So, if people had studied, people who study for years such things and spend all this time reasoning and studying military history, etc., probably they would be much more guarded in their criticism towards, even my unfinished work at that point. But he says then something very important: still, notwithstanding this imperfect form, I believe that an impartial reader, thirsting for truth and conviction, will rightly appreciate in the first 6 books the fruits of several years' reflection and a diligent study of war, and that perhaps he will find in them some leading ideas which may bring about a revolution in the theory of war. So this is a kind of positive, kind of an optimistic note on the interpretation of his own unfinished work. Should he have died before it was given a perfect form? Because he says an impartial reader, very important to be impartial as a reader, thirsting for truth, perhaps also more importantly in some way, because that should entail at least some objectivity, will rightly appreciate in the first 6 books the fruits of several years of reflection and diligent study of war. And he, von Clausewitz, fundamentally wishes that this read could give essentially some leading ideas in order to bring what he defines, even in German, a Revolution, so a true revolution in the theory of war. So this was written, as we've seen, in Berlin, July the 10th, 1827. Then, as we've seen, the editors add this unfinished memorandum that might have, I don't know, I actually haven't searched before making the video, but I guess you can find it by yourself. I will check it, however, also for the following videos, that when this second part, it is also actually more interesting than the first one, because we'll see now why. When it was written, because I think that von Clausewitz, he was sick for just some, couple of, like 1 week, something before dying, if I'm not wrong, if I remember the timing, and he might have well dictated this or written this in this kind of desperate condition when he saw death to be imminent. So he writes this: the manuscript of the conduct of the Great War, sometimes often translated also in Grande Guerre, in the French way. Von Clausewitz used, if I'm not wrong, literally this. He says, in fact, die Führung des großen Krieges. So he actually, it was literally the Great War. So the manuscript on the conduct of the Great War, which will be found after my death, in its present state can only be regarded as a collection of materials from which it is intended to construct a theory of war. Now this is very interesting. I repeat, I don't know when this was actually written. I don't want you to indulge into thinking that this was in his very last days, but it's just I think we really don't know. But he states this: with the greater part I'm not yet satisfied. And the sixth book is to be looked at as a mere essay. The sixth book, remember, is the one on the defense. I should have completed and remodeled it and have tried a different line. Now this suggests, in the way he's speaking, that he's somehow regretting now something he cannot change. So maybe he really was seeing that to be not to have time anymore to finish it. But then it has something very comforting and perhaps for those who know the Vom Kriege, very moving actually, because it says, but the ruling principles which pervade these materials I hold to be the right ones. It's beautiful actually. He says in German, allein die Hauptlineamente, welche man in diesen Materialien erschen sieht, halte ich für die richtigen in der Ansicht vom Kriege. So this is, then it explains, this is the they are the result of a very varied reflection, keeping always in view the reality and always bearing in mind what I have learned by experience and by my intercourse with distinguished soldiers. So never to be forgotten, von Clausewitz is not, opinating on what war is, creating something abstract. We will get into detail about this when we will get through the work proper. But this is the point. He was keeping always in view reality. Things for what they are, not as you wish it to be, like many critics of von Clausewitz actually wanted, starting from a certain moral assumption and criticizing von Clausewitz, writing the worst things like in sometimes in this, but keeping to the reality. So von Clausewitz is carving out reality through the observation of reality. Remember, he's been influenced by Kant. He actually believes that mankind has this ability of actually assessing certain knowledge and part of the reality for what it is, within even the boundaries of human knowledge that still exist. And then it has always this, that this work with reality is naturally theoretical in many ways, because reality naturally has to be interpreted and theorized and set into this big system that he admits. He says there can't be any fixed theory, but we can still outline certain principles, the ruling principles that he calls the Hauptlineamente, he wrote. But also adding the practice. This is typical of von Clausewitz in his method. He goes from the simple to the complex, to the little, to the large, eventually even to the practice, to the theory, and always keeping them in mind. So you can't really exclude them. There is no point in which he basically makes certain leaps of faith. He's extremely logical. He's extremely rational also in many ways, and he is able to express certain thoughts, certain ideas in a way that sometimes you might criticize because maybe it's not so direct. He uses also so many metaphors, etc., but the way he uses them are very often most likely because they are so effective and powerful, even just from a plastic or physical point of view. They make you understand really the concept. As we were saying, there is much of also physical language in his explanation. And this has this experience that he had learned naturally on the field. He enlisted into the Prussian army when he was 12. He fought all the Napoleonic wars until Waterloo, when he also participated at Ligny, for instance, the Battle of Ligny. Um, and um, and also the intercourse with distinguished soldiers. So even in the certain military personnel that had participated in certain actions and had fundamentally, been at least the most direct witness to certain military actions, had contributed to give a certain degree of reliability on the information that were collected and so on. Naturally, von Clausewitz looks often in many examples to the Napoleonic Wars, but it actually ranges throughout all history in these examples. But nevertheless, having known the art of war firsthand, having had to lead entire corps like von Clausewitz, the rising through the ranks, is something that has its importance. We will sometimes, I studied in the past, last year especially, what it means to be, how can you learn about, we'll see how important, for instance, military history is, even to perfect the same art of war for the commanders. So it would be, seducing to think that, if you study military history, you understand, even if, like leading an army, and theoretically that is what is actually history of military art compared to the military history in general is more concerned about the events. The history of military art is more diachronic. It has to do with the evolution of the armies, of the equipment, etc., the tactics, etc. So not really. I mean, there can be people where not military men can understand how to achieve certain things, or how to, however, analyze. And indeed, it is true that there are so many civilians, military historians, who actually understand war in general better than certain military men. It does exist at this point. Naturally, the military men perfectly know probably best what the cost of war is, really. But there are certain aspects that require objectively even a historical studying that normally, is not necessarily given to all military men. To other people who are engaged into war, maybe suffer enormously of it, but not necessarily have the awareness of what is going on. This with all respect, naturally, but it is true and must be affirmed without hypocrisy relatively to what it is really to know the whole thing, because history is something extremely serious and extremely complex and extremely, you need to dedicate yourself to it, not just having lived through a period and through an experience to have it got it all. It's not that simple. But this is a digression, excuse me for it. So von Clausewitz has this fate that essentially that there is the possibility of appreciating his work even through this imperfect form. Then he says, the seventh book is to contain the attack, the subjects of which are thrown together in a hasty manner. The eighth, the plan for a war, in which I would have examined war more especially in its political and human aspects. So, interestingly enough, he says, I would have. So, he knew at this point he couldn't anymore. But then he says, the first chapter of the first book is the only one which I consider as completed. Consider because maybe he left it open to further, possible perfectionment, but it will at least serve to show the manner which I propose to treat the subject throughout. So that's why the first book is actually very. He says the first chapter of the first book, but I think the first book is the only one was finished, actually, and it's definitely probably the most important, sometimes even the most beautiful to read, depending on what I believe if you really want to, if you're interested in the theory as such, because that's where he sets the main principles. Then it says the theory of great war, or strategy as it is called, is beset with extraordinary difficulties. So he says, so here he rejects the possibility of creating a let's read it, and again we may affirm that very few men have clear conceptions of the separate subjects, that is, conceptions carried up to their full logical conclusions. In real action, most men are guided merely by the tact of judgment, which hits the object more or less accurately, according as they possess more or less genius. This is the way in which all great generals have acted, and therein partly lay their greatness and their genius, that they always hit upon what was right by this tact. So this is very interesting, because von Clausewitz is introducing fundamentally to what constitutes the ability of being a great general or a military genius. And is this ability, this criterion, I don't know how you can better define that conceptually, but this even sensitivity in many ways, a sort of further sense of what is going on, that he uses this very, also in here, kind of physical analogy, says that it's this tact of judgment that is able to hit physically the object more or less accurately according to the genius that is there. It is important because it's as if there was here a fog of war that you have to hit into to understand what the hell is going on. The fog of war in von Clausewitz is not reduced at all to usually what fog of war is just conceived normally, not just from a term of reconnaissance, not even the lack of information from the external. Von Clausewitz believes that the fog of war is fundamentally also brought within the same chain of command of communication, for which an information can, for instance, be modified throughout its delivery, fundamentally, all the various stages. So, and naturally all the contradictory informations that arrives, and this ability of, really being a foggy overview of reality. So fundamentally the genius is the one that also, in virtue of certain characters, certain character of his nature, that there is a paragraph all dedicated to that, and we will read it one day, hopefully, that also drives this psychological profiles, etc. But there is this genial form that is able to basically look through the fog of war, to go hit where, not really look it through, but to go hit where this tact can really can hit the right object, fundamentally. That is the right decision, the right understanding. So he actually puts this aside, because it says this is basically the main virtue that all great generals, we could add in history, have been, acting through, fundamentally. But this is not important, because it says that's essentially a gift that person has, that ability that person has. But then it says, but when it is a question not of acting oneself, so aside from the individual capability, but of convincing others in a consultation, then all depends on clear conceptions and demonstrations of the inherent relations, and so little progress has been made in this respect that most deliberations are merely a contention of words, resting on no firm basis, and then ending either in everyone retaining his own opinion, or in a compromise from mutual considerations of respect, a middle course really without any value. This is very important, because here von Clausewitz is basically saying that the sight, fundamentally, this ability of having made, these conclusions, has to be coupled with an ability to deliver, to express this deliberation, these conclusions, fundamentally. So we can imagine von Clausewitz in his life having, countless times having got into debates in the headquarters and commands, etc., what decision had to be taken in virtue of all the various problems, and there is a lot also in the Vom Kriege relatively to this, and the problem there is not really whether a person is right or not at that point, but how the command responds, because naturally there is a hierarchy, and hopefully, a discipline, so that everybody will more or less obey to his superior. But the idea is that the subordinates also often have different ideas, also because many of them are actually engaged on the field, are the ones who have also better sight. So naturally the subordinates are very important for every commander to listen to. So von Clausewitz here is arguing that very often there is an inability, for whatever reason, to deliver correctly the conclusions of such full logical, from these right decisions. So these meetings can end, he says, in different ways. You can talk, and essentially not everybody will maintain his own opinion, and this is not really good, because it means that also, in terms of morale and cohesion and unit of command, it's complicated because everybody has a different opinion. On the other hand, it can end in a compromise for mutual considerations of respect. So you respect your commander, say, okay, well, I obey it, I even don't really know. And this doesn't really bring to any good, von Clausewitz says, because this is a middle course that has really no value in it, because such conclusions have to be explained in a way that have to be clear. These ideas have to be clearly explained. In fact, he says, clear ideas on these matters are therefore, however, not wholly useless. He says not wholly because he has just said previously that the fundamentally all great generals have been great also without this, but at the same time we can imagine an attrition brought also by the incapability of explaining clearly certain ideas. And then he adds something even more optimistic. He says, besides, the human mind has a general tendency to clearness, and always wants to be consistent with necessary order of things. So this means fundamentally that humans are reasonable. They tend to strive for clearness. We are objectively built like this from a neurological point of view. We want to. Humans are attracted by chaos because they want to figure it out fundamentally, and so humans are interested in assessing the necessary order of things. So even in a context like war, but this can be extended at this point with von Clausewitz also to other fields, and we will see it when it's exported in the field of military history proper and how historians should work. Well, this can essentially, there is von Clausewitz believes that in theory humans can arrive to a common consensus if these ideas are clearly expressed and they follow full logical conclusions, fundamentally. Full logical thinking. This is important because just like military history, von Clausewitz explains that very often military history is also a matter of debate. You have to think he belonged to this Prussian gentry, and obviously he had a career. He rose far to the top at one point. Into which matters of war were pretty much discussed. The Prussian aristocracy was all about war, traditionally speaking, at that point. As we have seen also in the video on von Clausewitz Life and Times, there was this end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century were definitely a period, times of great intellectual development, of great search for also for new theories, new patterns in which to frame knowledge and learning, and there was a lot of scientific progress. So there was also this proto-positivism in many ways that actually von Clausewitz doesn't really follow, because von Clausewitz is way more concrete and pragmatic. He doesn't believe that things go well, but that's also the genius of his theory. We will have the ability to look, the chance to look at it in another occasion. But fundamentally he says that you should, in the case of military history, when you can't actually, it's as if it was a series of rings of connections, of logical connections. When you don't have a logical connection, the true historian shouldn't make them a forced connection and to stress certain interpretations of history without concrete elements. Then in the case here of military command, however, I was thinking now that we just seen how generals have this tact corresponding to their genius that basically helps them to have this sort of sense of how things are going, but it is also important how these conclusions are expressed, how they are exposed to others, and how others can essentially benefit from it as well. So in fact here he goes, as we've seen, to his critics to the ability of creating a philosophical construction of the art of war. He says, owing to the great difficulties attending a philosophical construction of the art of war and the many attempts at it that have failed, most people have come to the conclusion that such a theory is impossible, because it concerns things which no standing law can embrace. This is very important, because this is a bit the lingering, I mean, I don't know how to say this, but it's the general, it's the ground on which von Clausewitz starts building his own theory, not as a law, but as a set of principles that somewhat really represent how war, really explain how war works, but do not give this cold, rational way, manualistic way of interpreting war as it was developing in other thoughts, like the one of Jomini, for which you have kind of a set of conditions that you can always foresee and apply as eventually to which you can apply responses, etc. Von Clausewitz goes far beyond where his genius actually is revealed in its truest form. So he says, we should also join, in fact, in this opinion, and give up any attempt at a theory were it not that a great number of propositions make themselves evident without any difficulty. Then he starts, and it ends basically with this, but through this very important set of I would say self-evident propositions that are a bit the cornerstone of von Clausewitz theory. He criticized the theory, but in practice he does structure a theory on his own, but it's the purpose of the theory that is quite different from the one he definitely is rightfully criticizing. Excuse me, I drink a little before I start talking about them, because they're very interesting and very important. So these propositions are all discussed eventually in the Vom Kriege. So here von Clausewitz is partly anticipating them, but he does it eventually because these are really the cornerstone, the words that Hauptlineaments, as he called them, basically. So the first one concerns that the defensive form, so the defense essentially has a negative object and is the stronger form of war, while the attack with the positive object is the weaker. This is a very important proposition, because he reveals essentially the relation between defense and attack is also here fundamental. He dedicates whole books to it, as we have seen. So he's essentially saying that the defense is a stronger form of war. If you really have to defend, the best form of defense is defense, according to von Clausewitz, not attack. Definitely, as the saying tells. in defense you're stronger. It's a stronger form. And at that point the defense entails an attack, or someone that comes to you and tries to dislodge you, to crush you while you are in defense. At a certain point in the paragraph dedicated to it, it explains also that this kind of combat that ensues is also the most rapid and the bloodiest one, usually. But it says that defense, however, in general, aside from has a broadly a negative object, because it basically delays the outcome of war, and this is negative overall because it consumes energies no matter what. So it has a negative object because it just postpones something that would have to happen, consuming resources, increasing losses intrinsically. But it's the stronger form. So in defense, you have this ability of resisting naturally that is higher than the attack that is said has the positive object, but it's the weaker form. This is very important, and it will be clarified in part also by the last proposition that we read now, that the one that is that every attack becomes weaker as it progresses. It's also very important. But the attack, in fact, is weaker because the energies of the attacker are depleted as the attack goes on. There is also in here a moment in which the attack has its greater momentum, reaches its apex, and that's very important. It should be somewhat timed and calculated. This is very important in military history when it comes to the attack, because you have to dislodge into automatically from wherever you are and go take the guy out while he's defending. So it's actually it's also very more complicated. It also entails more moral resources, not just physical ones. It requires more control. In fact, von Clausewitz eventually explains that in that passage, that there are also moments in which both the enemies are attacking, and it says in that case, you would imagine, for example, two people attacking, the clash is the greatest. Actually not. It's not more violent, because while both the contendants attack, essentially they are both undecided. The situation evolves much more quickly, and therefore these two sides are more prone to back off in a way or another. The quickest and bloodiest engagement is basically when the attacker, in fact, is trying to defeat someone who is in defense. And that is in fact something that it's very physical. The defense is letting the attack crash in itself. So it has intrinsically this brute force of resistance, of attrition, of slaughter, if you want, in itself. This proposition is very, very important. So we repeat it. The defensive form with a negative object is the stronger form. The attack with a positive object, the weaker. Very, very important. The second proposition we find here is that great results carry the little ones with them. That, therefore, strategic efforts might be referred to a certain centers of gravity. And here we get it. The Schwerpunkt. So the Schwerpunkt here, it's normally translated as centers of gravity. It's also kind of a geometrical concept, but it's not quite so in von Clausewitz's theory. The concept of Schwerpunkt is very, very complex, or better, it's not excessively complex, but I think it's, even von Clausewitz gives throughout the Vom Kriege several definitions of it, because it's it would be the barycenter sometimes, also known as center of gravity in other terms, but here the center of gravity is something very peculiar. On the interpretation of Schwerpunkt, also there have gravitated entire military doctrines sometimes. For instance, the United States, especially during the Cold War, had a very kind of physical and geographical idea of Schwerpunkt. They consider it as the military base, as essentially that those various strongholds that they use scattering the world to control, the at that point the communist bloc fundamentally. So they tended to give certain interpretations that really were, and this happened several times in history, tending to define Clausewitz theory, emphasizing more or less elements, but not really getting quite the first sense. The Schwerpunkt can be also something very much unphysical. It can be moral, it can be distance, it can be many things. We will naturally dedicate a great part to great attention to the concept of Schwerpunkt. Here we express it as center of gravity, but in this proposition, the sense of this is, and the most important part, perhaps at this point, is actually the first one. That great results carry the little ones with them. This actually goes in both ways. I make you an example. When you're able to break the enemy forces, you might say, well, maybe the single army is being destroyed, but the soldiers are still kind of individual fighters. They can turn up and kill and fight. Well, it doesn't really happen that way. When every army in every time in history collapses, all the little elements are carried out by the great ones. So when an army loses cohesion, for instance, it's done. You can have some that keeps resisting, which is also normal by certain sense. Usually when there is a retreat, there is always someone who stands, covering the retreat for someone and getting slaughtered usually. But it's the whole thing that collapses. Also because the enemy is pressing on it. We will see how important this is and how these propositions are also very important relative to the pursuit and keeping pressure on the enemy once it's defeated. But it also goes in, so it's as if the individual soldier at that point was carried away by this greater event, this greater despair. You can imagine, and this is how the beauty of von Clausewitz theory is that you apply these propositions to reality. They're actually true. If you study a battle, military historical battle, you understand that this is exactly how it works. This is the greatness of von Clausewitz, and you must actually study von Clausewitz together when you study military history, because it gives you a kind of material, pragmatic evidence, explanation of what is going on there. Many people think, I don't know why, but that von Clausewitz is just a theorist in the sense that he philosophized on war, maybe, but von Clausewitz is really rich, and this is perhaps the greatest help it can be to this very concrete and very realistic, very pragmatic evidence that, by the way, helps you also to understand, in theory, not just to understand war, but also theoretically to win one. And it's very difficult, in fact, I believe, when it's plenty of people who are passionate about military history out there, or war in general, but that maybe do not get these principles right. And this is the real problem, is getting the principles right. You can spend maybe an entire life reading certain things, but until you don't study the Vom Kriege, unless you're not a genius yourself like von Clausewitz and you figure it out by yourself, which is quite unlikely, because I doubt that you would be able to study all what von Clausewitz has studied back in the day, including military campaigns, in a serious way, one by one. I did it only once. It took me 1 year. Von Clausewitz did it, I don't know, I think in tens of times, so just saying. You can't figure these out, so you need them. And von Clausewitz opens your eyes, in this sense. This is what I wanted to say. And it's so important. I wanted to say that this thing of the great results carry the little ones with them goes actually both ways, because not just great results have an effect on the little ones, but vice versa. The concept of attrition is something that stems, according to von Clausewitz, although it's often not discernible, scientifically speaking, starts from the little things. And you can't really even tell from, which things made the whole thing go wrong, because it starts from the little ones that you can't really control individually. It might seem a theoretical statement, but actually it's quite realistic, because it might as well happen that when a battle is over, that you still don't know why it is. You know the outcome, but you can't really find out what was the decisive factor that brought the battle to an end. Not even if you're eyewitness, not even if you fought into the battle. This is a problem that you can observe even from the sources you use when you study military history, that certain people even participated to certain battles, but they didn't quite understand what the hell happened. I don't know if you ever studied the sources of the Battle of Azincourt, but from that it's evident that most of the people, even the eyewitnesses, didn't actually have a great grasp of what was going on. You can well understand it. Battles of tens of thousands of people, sometimes you couldn't even get the whole picture right. Naturally, at every level of the ranks, you have different perceptions of certain things. So naturally, studying such phenomena is very, very complex, and this is why it takes so much time even to figure out certain things and to extrapolate a principle like this. And we should be very thankful from Clausewitz, because he got into it literally as a commander and also as a military military historian, sorry. So someone who really spent literally his whole life about trying to figure out what war functions like for real, not because he, like other people, like culturalists or someone else who wakes up one day, sets a moral principle and say, okay, it has to be as I want it because I invented that thing, and it has to be as like I say. So a bit of respect also for von Clausewitz's theory in this sense must be done before talking, making relativism about his idea because someone else wrote against him is, first of all, perhaps not having clear in mind what von Clausewitz actually did in his work. And this is not really a matter of opinion, which is something that I don't really like to say, but von Clausewitz offers the evidence to be understood. So this is also very important, while other thinkers did not quite do this. Other proposition, which one is this? Oh yeah, this is interesting, that a demonstration is a weaker application of force than a real attack, that therefore there must be some special reason for resorting to the former. Well, this is kind of relatively simple to understand, but it's still very important to reflect on it, because here it says a demonstration. Now the demonstration can be of any form. It can be just a show-off that doesn't even entail actual combat, as well as as combat proper. But a demonstration is just saying, getting out there and doing something that fundamentally consumes energies, not to obtain a decisive action, but just to telling something to the enemy. Now this can be very important sometimes because you can imagine all the minor operations that are carried out, even skirmishes, ambushes, reconnaissance, and also this kind of confusing or feints or ruses and stuff like that to act psychologically on the enemy as well. But von Clausewitz makes here a point of psychophysical resources. Fundamentally, it says, those resources that you spend for this show-off must have a reason, because you're effectively detracting them from the real attack that is actually the one that should punch the hardest. Remember what we said now in the first proposition also about the as defense as the negative purpose. Well, this is kind of similar, because in the demonstration actually there is a sort of delay also in here of the real attack. There should be the one that with its full forces could actually make the greater impact and therefore solve this thing relatively quickly and hopefully with just the necessary losses and not delaying this. So a demonstration can also be relatively costly, and therefore von Clausewitz says there must be some special reason for resorting to such demonstrative actions. That naturally can exist, and they can also be they might have also a political objective, or at least an influence on politics. Naturally, war is a prosecution of politics by other means, but it might as well happen that it's a transitive thing. I mean, also war has an impact on politics. Just think about the little raid on Japan after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. You might say, well, what was that for? It was fundamentally a great risk, also for the pilots, for the things we know how it ended, also, but it was a great show-off. That showed the Japanese that the U.S. could hit on the Japanese ground as much as the Japanese had attacked the Americans on their own ground. So that's very important. It was an extremely powerful message. So that's a beautiful example of a demonstration that actually gave a great moral edge to the Americans at that point, because they proved one point that was carried out. In fact, war is a persecution of politics by other means. In that sense, that was showing the Japanese that the Americans would have not gotten over that, and that they had their days counted fundamentally. So here, another proposition, beautiful also in here, that victory consists not merely in the conquest on the field of or the field of battle, but in the destruction of armed forces physically and morally, which can in general only be effected by a pursuit after the battle is gained. This is very important and also relatively perceivable. It can be understood relatively easily, because it basically says it doesn't just take to take the ground to obtain a victory, a full victory at least. It's not enough to claim victory just for gaining the ground. You also have to destroy the enemy armed forces physically and morally, so psychophysically fundamentally, and this can be generally be effected by a pursuit after the battle is gained. This is very important. In all military history you see that actually the greater damage was done not properly during combat, but actually only after the enemy, one of the sides began to rout. So it's at that point that the slaughter followed most of the times, the greater achievements could be obtained. And undoubtedly there can be certain tactical victories that maybe are have a very negative strategic outcome, because just like Pyrrhic victories, you can take the field but not quite defeat the whole enemy force. That can maybe strike back in another moment. So actually full victory is the one that is achieved only not just driving the enemy away from the battlefield, but also annihilating him. And the pursuit is the moment when this happens. Naturally, there are different types of... also here, I don't know, maybe von Clausewitz surely explains it at a point. There is a difference between a rout and a withdrawal, but I guess that is what makes the difference eventually, and especially on how the pursuit is carried out. Because one thing is advancing with your whole army, still advancing on this, at this point, not just a tactical dimension, a strategical dimension, just pushing the enemy away, and the enemy retreats. One thing is actually having broken the enemy army on the field and then pursuing the fleers, those who were fleeing, fundamentally, and annihilating them. And here it's important that it stresses both the physical and the moral side of the destruction of the enemy forces, because it's not just about the moral forces. It also have to consider that you have to effectively, one of the objectives of war, the objective was also to disarm the enemy, to make it inoffensive in many ways. So maybe you can break the spirit of an army after to a defeat, fundamentally, but that army might fight again if it has enough resources. So also the physical destruction here, that is intended both of the human bodies, but also of the materials, the supplies, seizing the enemy camp, or just physical also in the way where you push these people. What are the options that you leave them after the battle? Where to retreat, where to go. There are certain strategic scenarios in which at one point you can't really much react, or you can't have a safe line to retreat to, or that there are worse battlefields at that point you can't hope to win, especially after you have been just defeated fundamentally, so you're ever weaker than you were before. So this is very important, because it's a way to really annihilate, consequently, the whole enemy army in claiming a real victory at this point. Then this other proposition, that successes are always greatest at the point where the victory has been gained. That, therefore, the change from one line and object to another can only be regarded as a necessary evil. So, this is also very important, a bit more subtle, but nevertheless very, very logical, because this proposition basically means that, and it's naturally referred also partly to the previous one, when you, that the major successes proper, so here it's not just about the victory in itself, just like a claim or as de facto something, but the actual success are always greatest at the point where victory has been gained. So in that moment in which the enemy basically is more disorganized, is broken, and you can achieve the greater results, fundamentally exploiting that condition of weakness of the enemy. So here it stresses actually the point of the movement. So changing one line and object at that point of the victory is maybe not excessively good, because after a victory you have necessarily to take a next step. It's not simple. It's not over yet. And maybe one victory, one battle, but things can evolve eventually into other things. So at that point also the victory triggers certain conditions that have to make you reformulate essentially what you have to do. So changing from one line or one object to another might be uncomfortable in some ways, especially when you're relaxed after one victory. So okay, well, yeah, then we have broken the enemy. Instead, here Von Clausewitz says no, you have to go on, you have to keep on pressure. The successes are the greatest at this point, but you don't have to sleep on them. You have to go on, and if that victory opens you to another space, then maybe it's different, another opportunity, let's say, that maybe it's different from the initial one that you had planned. You have to change that line, you have to change direction, you have to change object in order to exploit that success, because that's the moment in which you're going to gain the most out of it, So it's imperative in many ways that you do it, because at this point this change is just, in fact, as he says, to be regarded as a necessary evil, and it's kind of silly to idle in there or to just go on with other ideas that do not allow you to fully exploit this success, and you have to press on. This is very important. And many after many victories, you can argue that the the winners kind of didn't act much and were successful counterattacks that were mounted essentially naturally with enormous difficulties, given that the more resources, material resources, presumably also are very low. But they can exploit this in preparation, fundamentally, of the winner to the new scenarios that have open, new options that have open. At least this is how I interpreted it. I had some problems there reading it and trying to explain it, but I guess this is the right explanation and it kind of makes sense. But if there is some expert here, I would like to hear the opinion as well, because it's gave me something to think about. Being otherwise relatively simple at this point. So, other proposition that a turning movement is only justified by a superiority of numbers, generally, or by the advantage of our lines of communication and retreat over those of the enemy. Then there is this corollary, basically, because the next proposition says that flank positions are only justifiable on similar grounds to the one of the first proposition. So here it's basically saying turning, so encircling, getting around the enemy, or just flanking the enemy, is fundamentally. Let me check one thing, because I want to be sure I get certain things right here. Yeah, not just flanking, but also flank positions here, it says. So that fundamentally you have to be, first of all, in a condition of superiority to carry out certain maneuvers. It's not easy in the first place. And this superiority can derive either by superiority of strengths, actually. Here it says numbers, but I think here I think it says we will ignite out. Hold on. Yeah, it's. Let me check once again. Well, yes, fundamentally superiority of strengths. Okay, so you have, let's assume, to make it simple, the strength is numerical in some way. So you can turn around the enemy because you have this overwhelming advantage, this overwhelming superiority, and you can allow yourself basically to carry out this operation with relative ease. There is always a risk factor, but you can be supported by that. You can also be supported by naturally an advantage in the lines of communications, because or retreat over those of the enemy. Sometimes are the same relatively. The idea is that if you have enough, if your retreat is clear, you can also, your way of retreat is clear. It's most likely where also your supplies are gonna come from. And there is also unnecessary communications between the bodies of the army, also for carrying out a successful maneuver, coordinating it, and so on. So encirclement, especially, is quite of a delicate maneuver, and is justified fundamentally by this. Either superiority of strengths, or this, or fundamentally these lines of communications or retreats that are particularly favorable to you, or maybe unfavorable to the enemy, because this goes both sides. Maybe you're able to encircle the enemy, therefore cutting his supply lines, so he's screwed basically, and that should work hopefully also for you. But really, these are principles in outline. So naturally, every single military operation is by themselves. We've seen also the flank positions are kind of justifiable on similar grounds, because fundamentally they have to keep into consideration, where these flanks are, if you can carry out certain flanking maneuvers, what that will bring you to, what options there are to retreat as well, how you can connect to the main body of the army, to the retreating point, etc. And also the last proposition is probably one of the most important of these all, is that every attack becomes weaker as it progresses. This is also fundamental. We have outlined it before when we're talking about the strong and weak form of respectively defensive attack and respectively negative and positive purposes. Well, this aspect of attack is very important because every attack has its own momentum which has to be calculated, and every attack becomes weaker as it progresses immediately. It's really like a physical thing. Naturally, the attack has it becomes weaker also in terms of potential, because not necessarily the attack starts with the highest momentum. Actually, not quite so, because usually the advance is the Angriff, as von Clausewitz calls it. It's something that usually happens relatively slowly. Then it's just when you get in proximity of the enemy that you have the greater momentum. You basically attack in charge or en masse with this greater thing. But here von Clausewitz is observing at the whole system. You know, the moment you start advancing, or maybe that you wait before advancing, you're losing resources, whether psychical or physical. So you're fundamentally, the more you wait, the more the attack is prolonged, and the less effective it is. And this is applicable in theory also to defense in a certain way. I mean, given that the defense is not that these forces, both in attack and in defense, are not refueled in a certain way, fundamentally this is the negative purpose in practice. Is the more you delay, the more you lose something in general as a system. So this is why also von Clausewitz brought us this idea that operations have to be quick and moving. This was a relative principle to the Napoleonic War, with all the debate of, World War the First, whether, but this is beyond what von Clausewitz said. It doesn't refer to that. This referred on how certain doctrines were applied on the technological transformations and so on. But the Clausewitzian principle is at this point universal, because every kind of attack grows weaker as it progresses, and the attack can be, at several levels as well. It can be a small unit tactics, can be at division level. So there can be many things going on, but it's the concept of attacking that entails that the resources get depleted the more you go on, because you're actively advancing. So also there is a very important point of apex of the momentum that is critical, that is crucial, because it's the one you basically have to break. Think about Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. That's a beautiful example, which fundamentally, because of all the factors you can imagine, the nature of the ground, the forces entailed, the lack of preparatory, bombardment, the Confederate artillery. Think about just certain factors like visibility. Gettysburg, like in many other battles before, with certain different type of chemical technology, you could have actually less smoke on the field. After first shots, basically it was like walking into a mist. Just thinking there, just marching, how many resources were lost, also because of lack of visibility. Like the wall cohesion that is also required into a good attack to deliver the highest effect, and this is part of what that momentum also is made of, was decreasing. So there are so many attritional factors that you can observe, even from in real life. When you go attack something, can be everything. Also metaphorically, you realize that you grow banally, you grow weaker yourself, you grow tired, you grow resourceless. You need to resupply, to be backed up, because you can't do it by yourself. So the attack has this intrinsic, more more evident, depletion the more it goes on. And it's a matter of a good general to understand, where's the momentum of the attack lays, and if it is enough to break the enemy resistance at that point. Like at Gettysburg, Lee wanted basically this attack. He had this tunnel vision. At that point, he decided this attack. Longstreet knew, for instance, this was butchery fundamentally. It would be, everybody knew it, but at that point the difference would have been made by just this outcome of the iron arm between the two armies, and that had most of its outcome related to the resources that were depleted during the advance of the Confederate Army under the Unionist artillery fire on that open ground, etc. So this is very important, and it is valid. This is really what von Clausewitz was pointing at, and what we can read the Vom Kriege through is that these propositions are always there, are always true. I mean, the single battle naturally is influenced by many factors and can can take different turns fundamentally, but the principle is there and it always works. So it's just the secondary elements that influence the variables, but it's as if the system always held in that way, so that you can have radical outcomes, radically different outcomes, but fundamentally the fundamentals are always there. This is very, very important. So we made it. I think the next video we will try to we will read the introduction that von Clausewitz wrote to the Vom Kriege, and it's shorter than this one. It says it's more, an introduction to the reading, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, this notice, this Nachricht, was very important in many ways, very revelatory of von Clausewitz' intentions, theory, and also offers these propositions that are definitely useful and should be learned as a mantra. At this point, what von Clausewitz will, in order to understand von Clausewitz' theory. Naturally, basically everything he writes should be taken as a mantra, because as we were saying also in the other videos, what you need to know about von Clausewitz is really literally everything he says. It's not a read, it's not an opinion, it's a big system you have to understand. It's all chained, logically speaking. You can't jump one passage and pretend to understand the whole. So it's very complicated also to explain in many ways. But I don't know, on Schwerpunkt I will try to make my best. I know I'm not an expert, but I think it's nevertheless important to talk about von Clausewitz and to really give him the credit that he deserves, really. And I believe, I told you why I'm making this series. I believe that the world can be better through Clausewitz in theory. If anything, to know how to use responsibly violence, ultimately, that is, war in its truest meaning, in its action as an instrument of politics. So this is not a call for militarism nor pacifism. It is really about getting things, looking always at what reality is, not for having taken a position on something, but really trying to seek for the truth, for what we can. Obviously, the truth is unfortunately most of the times out of our the range of our poor gnosiological means, but it's nevertheless important to at least direct ourselves towards it and trying to understand it for what we can. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.